So last week we started this new series, Count Me In for the Next Gen, and it was kind of an overview of our next generation and family ministries. Today we're going to go a little bit deeper into Creek Kids in particular, and so we're going to talk about our ministry from birth through fifth grade, and then next week we'll talk about student life, which is 6th through 12th grade, and just kind of how all of this works together. I love this quote that we kind of ended on last week from Dr. John Trainer. He said, "Children are not a distraction from more important work. They are the most important work." And I think that kind of sometimes gets lost. I know when I talked this morning to our kids ministry volunteers, and I just wanted to thank them so much for all that they do all year long to make that possible. I said, when I started here and there were just 27 of us here at Coffee Creek, that room we were in doing the training was the kids ministry room, and it just had a bunch of toys in there, and it was just like a kind of a catch-all for all ages of kids. And we didn't have a planned curriculum, classes like we do now, and we have all this space for kids, and it's so awesome. And I think sometimes as adults we can think for a moment that maybe what we're doing in here is the most important thing, and that's the babysitting or something. I think sometimes we get that in our head, and I tried to tell them this morning that, once again, I don't think that's true. I think I get to babysit the adults for an hour so that we can do our kids ministry, because I think that's some of the most important stuff that happens at Coffee Creek, is those holy moments when kids are learning these stories and learning about the love of Jesus and getting to kind of understand another aspect of who they're going to be as they grow up. And I'm going to share a scripture with you about that in a moment. But I just wanted to think about this for a second, this idea that kids aren't a distraction. They're not extra. They are very important in our work. And so as we want to share this teaching with our whole community that God is for you, we want every man, woman, and child to not only have heard that once in their life, but we want them to really understand what that means and what that looks like. And if you know anything about teaching something to someone, especially it's not math, right? And we're not teaching math. That's not a math concept. But when I was a kid, math was hard for me. And so math, you had to come at it from lots of different angles for me to go, oh, I get this basic concept that sometimes other people get. It's the same way for this kind of concept, that God loves you, that your Creator loves you, that you messed up and He still cares about you, that He still sent Jesus to the cross for you. That's tough to own. That's tough to get our head wrapped around. And so sometimes you just hear that once and it doesn't make a lot of sense. I remember I heard the message many different times in many different ways and read it, and people told it to me, and it was in a story format, and I saw it in a movie, and none of it clicked until that day that it finally made sense. It was like that light going off. And I finally understood how much God cared for me and how much He'd been chasing after me, even though I'd been pushing back away from Him. And so with kids, it's not so much about 1 week is the certain message is going to be all the kids go, it makes sense. It's just a slow process of helping awaken people to this truth that God is for them. We seek to do that for adults. We seek to do that for men and women and moms and dads, and we seek to do that for kids. And so Creek Kids Ministry is our biggest idea of doing that for these age of children. I wanted to share with you our recent statistics. So this is year-over-year growth, the past 12 months compared to the previous past 12 months of average attendance in our Creek Kids program. We jumped from 71 enrolled to 115 enrolled, and our average attendance was 93 in 2024 so far. This is birth through 5th graders. And so with growth, it's awesome. It's great that we have these enrolled kids. We don't see them all usually on one Sunday. Usually they come on different Sundays, but it's great to see. It's amazing. But if you think about that, that's a lot of kids, and that's a lot of volunteers that have to manage that and have to work with that every single week. And so the other part of that comes out is there's curriculum, there's funding that has to be in place for that to take place, the classroom environments, the crafts, the fun things they do, the silly things they do, the training resources. And so before we go too deep, I want you to understand the theological component. And what I mean by that is the basis of where we get this idea of why we do this in the first place. We don't do it for babysitting. I know there's a lot of misconceptions about that, but we do it because Jesus taught us to do this. And so I want to dive into that first and foremost to get our basis for this from Mark chapter 9. And this is a great teaching here. I love this idea because Jesus is kind of answering some questions, and the disciples are still really confused about everything. And one thing that's really prominent in the society where Jesus is teaching is that children are very low on the totem pole. They're not, we talk about gender roles in New Testament times and how women are not highly valued, and that's absolutely true. And you see that pervasive some in cultures today. You still see that. But Western cultures kind of come out of most of that. But children were even lower than that. Children were just considered almost useless. I mean, they're just not valued at all. And Jesus pushes back on that, and he fights that. They were just dragging children away from Jesus, like, you can't be around Jesus. And so he sits down with them, and he does something really unique. So he's a teacher, right? Jesus is this well-thought-of teacher. People are sitting around him wanting to hear him, whether it's thousands of people that are sitting around to hear him. The Sermon on the Mount, we have tons of people hearing him. We have small groups where people are gathering around, but Jesus is a well-thought-of, smart, intelligent teacher. People really want to hear from him. In this environment, he does something, a physical action, and when he does that, he teaches a huge lesson to these people. So Mark chapter 9 here, verse 36, says, "Then he put a little child among them, and taking the child into his arms, he said to them," so he takes the child up and gives the child place of honor and says, "Anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me. And anyone who welcomes me welcomes not only me, but also my Father who sent me." There are other recorded cases where they try to limit the number of children that can talk to Jesus. And he's like, we're not playing that game. And so Jesus raises the plight of children. He continually says, we got to look after children. We got to look after their needs. In a culture that really didn't care about kids at all, Jesus elevated them and said they're not property. They are to be cared for and loved. They are creations of God. Jesus equates here in this scripture, which I find really interesting, welcoming children with welcoming himself, which he then equates to welcoming the Father. So you are welcoming God, you are welcoming Christ as you welcome children. He highlights the spiritual weight and significance of kids' ministry. But now let's flip that on its side, or maybe upside down completely. What if we do the opposite? What if we're not welcoming to children? Then by inverse property, we are obviously not welcoming to Jesus and not welcoming to God the Father. So, adults, if we are only concerned about our own needs and our own wants and our own desires to the exclusion of the next generation, we are, by definition, according to Christ, holding him at bay. Now, all of a sudden, we've just stepped on everyone's toes, haven't we? Because we go, oh, so when I put my preferences above those of children, or my needs above those of others, all of a sudden, it's not just an interaction with that age group or that generation I don't like or don't understand. All of a sudden, I am pushing back on God, pushing back on Jesus. I remember a pastor telling me one time, a friend, he was like, couldn't find the baptistry at his church. And he was trying to set up for it. He couldn't find the baptistry. Finally, he asked a secretary in the church, and she was like, yeah, it's back in this basement area, and you've got to go down there and find it. And he went down and found it. And inside the baptistry was all the stuff for babies and kids, like just thrown in there and lopped all over it, and it was dusty and like cobwebs. And he was like, so basically We're not baptizing anyone, and we've thrown all of the kids' supplies into this one dark area that is stinky with mold and not expecting to be used. And the visual that drew up when he said that for me was, so what we're essentially pushing back on is saying no to the idea Jesus taught here in the scripture, that we welcome kids, we welcome their families, we welcome them in. And as we do that, we welcome Christ, which obviously we should be wanting to do, right, as a church of Jesus. But more importantly, Jesus here challenges these first century ideas, these social status and strata. He challenges these ideas where children had zero context and status, and he says they would be unwelcome, but we are going to be different, church. We are going to be different than culture. We're going to be countercultural. We're going to welcome children in. We're going to say they have a place here and a purpose here. And the point is that real servant leadership turns things on their head. And it says the first will be last and the last will be first. And Jesus does that over and over and over. One of my favorite authors when I was growing up wrote this book called Upside Down World, and he was talking about how Jesus just takes everything, every cultural norm, every expectation, and turns it upside down. And you and I can join in that work when we join others and join hands and link arms and do the hard and difficult things that it takes to welcome children. Now, that's not the easiest thing to do, right? It's not the easiest thing to do to welcome children and to be patient with that and to invest in that and to take time and volunteer for that, but it is valuable. I wear a lot of hats as a pastor. I read the other day that there are at least 16 competencies you must have to be a pastor, and it's one of those wild jobs. It's not akin to almost any other job because there's so many different things that you're kind of skilled in. You're not really good at any of them, but you kind of have to be good at a little bit of a lot of different things. And a lot of the jobs are things that no one else wants to do, right? And so I have evaluated over the past 24 years or so I've been doing this job that I have skills just like everybody else, and I have things that I lean in towards like I'm better at. And so I have some things that I'm really good at that I like to do, and those are strengths. And then I've done these tests and evaluations where you look at your weaknesses, right? You find your strengths, you find your weaknesses, and things that I'm not good at and I despise to do. And they're all part of my job, though. And so I do things, I do dishes every week here. I plunge a toilet about once a week here. I've hung from the ceiling before on those big scissor lifts, about electrocuted myself over there on that light. So I've done a lot of different things, right? And then I do, research, and I have a vast library of thousands and thousands of volumes. Many of them are digital now. And so I do research on theological topics, and I'll get several questions a week that, stretch me beyond. And I'm saying, these are big questions that people have that I'll be like, I don't know the answer, but I got to research it. So I'll look into it. I get big prayer requests every week, and some of them I know about, and some of them I can point people in the right direction towards. Books, I'll get book requests or like a topic I don't know much about, but I'll say, well, I've read a book on it, and here's a book that you might value. I'll pray for people. I try to come every week with a fresh and insightful teaching for you. Sometimes that's better than others. I always say, well, they can't all be home runs, but, we're trying to get through the bases every Sunday. And so all of that, it's all like a big deal. And I really love my job. I love the fact that I get to wear a lot of different hats most of the time. But there is one hat that I just despise. I hate it. I really, really hate it. And I'm not good at it. And it's not difficult to discern that I'm not good at it, but it's fundraising. It's the fundraising part. I'm not good at it. I would be terrible as a nonprofit person, fundraiser. I'm just not good at it. I don't enjoy it. I think I don't enjoy talking about money very much, even though this is a nonprofit. We 100% operate on what you give. Like, there is no rescue out there. There's no boat out there. There's no Goodwill or anything that cuts us a check. We don't get grants for anybody. So 100% comes from the people of the church, right? But I don't know. I just always say it. I went to a webinar, and I did like an online survey they had for you, but like your pre-homework for it, and it was like you get an F basically and I was like, oh great, thanks, this is gonna be a great webinar. And then I go to the webinar, and I'm just like, I get this like used car salesman feeling from it, like they're like, okay, and then this is how you talk about it in church, and I'm like, oh, I don't like this. It feels commercialized. It feels like a sales process, and I was like, no, I don't like that. And then I read a book on it. I try to like up my skills, like you would do when you find a weakness in your life. You try to up your skills, and I'm just like, man, I just really don't like it. So what's amazing to me is that in spite of my weakness over these last past 15 years, in spite of that weakness, God has continually helped us to thrive, has helped people catch a vision for what we're trying to do here, and people give generously. And I wanted to think about today, wanted to share with you in an anonymous way one such person that has come up time and again when we get in a pickle or we have a huge need in front of us. And it started happening probably, I think I looked about 7 years ago or so when we were doing something special for Creek kids, putting on a camp, and this person just had it on their heart that there would probably be some kids that wouldn't be able to afford to go, and just said, how much do we need to make sure that every kid that wants to go can go? And that wasn't something I was tracking with. I wasn't thinking about that at that time. When it was said to me, I was like, oh, I should have thought about that. And wow, that's huge. And so we did the math, and we looked at what was happening. And I said, oh, this is a big figure. Here you go. I was like just expecting, like I'm the worst salesman ever. Like, it's like, yes, I don't know if you want to go on a date or anything with someone dumb like me, but, I guess. And, it was that kind of thing. I was like, oh, this is awful. I'm like, okay, no problem. Wrote a check and we're done. And I was like, what do you say at that point? Like, I didn't even know what to say. Like, thank you. It almost seems like it's not enough, right? And then there's been times here where we've had a need, and I've prayed about it, and like a check will come through the mail, or for years we had people, I don't know who this was, I still don't know to this day, stuffing cash in the front door of the church so that when I would get here on Monday morning, I would open it up and just cash would fly everywhere. It was kind of like that Chuck E. Cheese thing where the tickets are flying at you and you're trying to grab them all. I would open the doors, and one time I was sick, and the janitor was the first one to come in on Monday morning. And I mean, she was scared to death. She like texted me. I was like, hey, cash just exploded out the front door. I want you to know how much it was, and I didn't take any. I don't know what's going on. I'm like, I'm sorry. I thought it was always going to be me that was getting that. I'm sorry, but just put it in an envelope, put it in the offering box, you'll be good. But out of all those things, I just say that to tell you, like, there's not like an orchestrated master plan for all of that, but just we're able to thrive in kids ministry, whether it's curriculum we have the best curriculum out there. It is also consequently the most expensive curriculum out there that exists. But we use the best for our kids ministry because we believe in it, and we believe in what the value of it to our children. And so many years this has been happening just over and over, that as people are praying about it, I don't have to like coerce people, because just as God convicts them, they are blessed and they want to respond. Some of them ask, how can I respond? Some of them just respond. But as I was reading the scriptures this week and thinking about this, I remembered in Deuteronomy, we've talked about Deuteronomy a lot, about how we remind kids about who God is. But I rewinded back a chapter and found this. This is in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament. It says, watch out. Be careful never to forget what you yourself have seen. Do not let these memories escape from your mind as long as you live, and be sure to pass them on to your children and grandchildren. What you see here is this kind of warning, right? Not to let the faith die, because it could have, right? Over the last 2,000 years, how easy would that have been for the faith to just completely die out, especially if you think about like the Dark Ages. If you study medieval history, like I think it's very easy to like fantasize that Christianity could have just completely been obliterated. And yet, every generation has been faithful to pass the truth of Jesus along to the next generation, so that today Christianity is larger than it's ever been. Almost 2.6 billion in the world. It's just, started with these 12 and just massively exploded over the continents of our world, starting as a small faith in Jerusalem. An explosion has happened. And so what you see has been the opposite of Deuteronomy 4:9 here. What you see is people have not given up. They have been sure to pass them along to children and to grandchildren, been sure to pass the baton to the next generation. And that's really what I want us to think about as we pray over and think about kids ministry today, is it's like we're passing a baton. It's like you would do in almost anything that's very important that you want to pass along to the next generation, not forgetting ourselves, not forgetting that we are that torchbearer. We are that baton bearer. We are the person in the relay that has the responsibility to pass it off. And even those of you that don't have kids anymore, or your nest is emptied, or you never had kids, we still are part of the church family, and we have a responsibility to keep passing that baton, making sure that it doesn't drop on our watch, that we are responsible to the next generation. I love what the psalmist wrote here in Psalm 78. We will not hide these truths from our children. We will tell the next generation about the glorious deeds of the Lord, about his power and his mighty wonders. It's this idea that if we fail to pass it along, it's like we're hiding it or keeping it for ourselves. Maybe that's a better analogy. It's like we've said, no, I'm just going to keep this truth for myself. I'm excited that I know Jesus, but I'm not going to worry about passing that along. I'm not going to invest in that. I'm not going to volunteer for that. And so instead it says, don't do that. Don't hide it, but actively be telling the next generation about what God has done in your life, about what you have seen him accomplish. I read this author who said this one time. He said, the future belongs to those who give the next generation reason for hope. And Desjardins was the one that wrote about America in the early days. And one of the biggest things that he saw in America was the power of the church to create community and to create this opportunity to bring us together. So hope is something people are hungry for. There's never been a year go by that the surveys don't talk about the hunger for hope amongst all ages. People are looking for hope. But this is more than a temporary hope. It's more than a fanciful thinking hope. It's more than a fantasy hope. It's a hope that will sustain us, a hope that will outlast our influence and our words, a hope that will become our legacy, and that is the hope of Jesus. Imagine what we could create if each one of us committed to using our gifts to give hope to the next generation, to share that hope of Jesus, to direct them to the source of healing and inspiration, to not hoard our gifts or our knowledge, but instead to share them freely with that next group. Now, as you have heard this morning, more than any this summer, this noise is amazing, isn't it? You've heard more noise from them today. They were up here and then they ran upstairs and they're having fun. And there is chaos in kids ministry. Have no misgivings about that. It is chaotic up there. And those teachers are watching that clock and they're going, he better start wrapping it up. I don't hear music yet. Sometimes the doors will pop open and one will just step out. And when I get a stern look from that room right there, I'm like, well, we'll pick up next week. And just put a little note there. We'll stop there today. Because sometimes I feel like I could go on, right? When I was a young man and started out, my very first sermons were very short, like 6 minutes, and I just stammer the whole time. But as I got going, I would do 55 minutes, no worries. And, in the first churches I served where they would have like 2 songs and it was, piano and really short hymns, that was fine. Now it's a little different. And I get the looks. So from the second floor, when those doors start opening, I'm like, okay, all right, time to wrap it up. So what can we do with this chaos? Well, I want to share with you this. I think in the joyful chaos of kids ministry, what we find is a deeper and more vibrant connection to God's purpose. Whether you are someone that is going to enter those classrooms and work with Jessica and work with that team of people, and you have a gifting there, because it is a gifting, and I do not have that gifting, but if you have that gifting, that's awesome. Now, maybe you don't have that gifting. And maybe you're like, that scares you to death, and you don't want anything to do with those classrooms. That's fine. I understand that too. Perhaps you will be someone that will be like that other person I talked about today that says, hey, what are the needs? What can we do? Maybe you'll be like I talked about last week, a behind-the-scenes person that says, hey, I got some time I can give. Hey, I can knock off a couple of these things on these checklists that we need to get done and we need to prepare for. Whatever it looks like, I believe you will find a deeper, more vibrant connection to God's purpose for your life the more you interact with the next generation and being a part of passing that baton. And the reason I know that's true is because Jesus himself taught, when you welcome kids, you welcome me. When you welcome kids, you welcome the Father. So, number one question I get from people that become Jesus followers, number one question I get, what does God expect of me? Like, I appreciate that I received the freedom from Jesus. I am free from my sins. I'm washed clean and clear. I believe that absolutely. I believe absolutely that Jesus went to the cross and died for me so that when I die, it won't be my final death, but I'll be in the resurrection with him and the church. Man, that's awesome. They're so appreciative of all that God has done for them. What does God want me to do? And that is a big question. And the more I study that and the more I think about that, it has a lot to do with what we say our purpose is to love God. And that's like a whole loaded thing right there, right? How do I love God? What does he want from me? Well, it is worship, but it's welcoming him and to do good to one another, to love the Lord our God with everything we are and love our neighbor as ourselves. And part of your neighbors are the little people, the Creek kids. And you've been brought into this place and this time in this community, and you can make an impact. And it may not look like one specific thing. It may be lots of different things. So the question before you, can we count you in for the next generation? In the app, I've put several different ideas there of what you could do. And basically, this is an outline of some of those next steps you might be thinking about. Perhaps it is to volunteer in Creek Kids, and you just need to tell Jessica, hey, I'll be a substitute teacher, because, once school really gets underway, what's going to start happening? People are going to start dropping like flies with illness, right? You've been away from school all this time, and all the viri are coming back in and the bacteria coming back together. And then we'll hit that wave of, flu eventually, late October, and we'll have people out, and we'll have lots of different things going on, so we'll need substitutes. Maybe you want to do that. What about just sharing your story? Now, people sometimes kind of downplay this, but I want to tell you this is huge. And I've seen this happen at Coffee Creek on multiple occasions where people have shared their story. This is people that maybe have teenagers or maybe are empty nesters, are able to tell people with toddlers, you are going to survive, friend. They see them come in on Sunday morning and they look like they got no sleep last night and they're like drinking their fourth cup of coffee and the kids are like just shouting and screaming and throwing donuts everywhere. And they come up to them and they put an arm around them and they say, you're going to survive. We need people like that in our life. Or you see a mom and dad at each other's throats and they need an older couple to tell them, you're going to make it through this. Or someone loses their job and they're really worried about they're going to be able to feed their family, take care of their needs. Someone is able to say, yeah, me too, that happened to me too. We need those kind of people in our life to say, you're not alone. That's what I mean about sharing your story. Sharing your story with the parents of these kids and helping them is huge. People need to hear that. They need to hear how they get through these they just seem like they're insurmountable, but they're not, because many of you have been through those situations and you've come out on the other side. People need to hear that. You need to share your story. What would it be like for you to say yes to providing resources? And maybe that's, special needs. Maybe it's an ongoing thing. Our ongoing regular general offering is what funds all of this. And so maybe that's just you stepping up. How about praying for them? Praying for kids, praying for our teachers in our classes, praying for their schools. Prayer is huge. And the more that you align yourself with the heart of God in those prayers, the more that you're going to experience the joy and the benefits that come from that.